There's a particular silence that falls over a room when someone asks, genuinely, but how do you know that's true? Not aggressively, not as a gotcha, just, how do you know? Watch what happens next. Most people reach for a story before they reach for an answer. They reach for a feeling and dress it up as evidence. That moment, that small flinch before the deflection, is happening more often now, in more places, to more people than at any point in recorded history. And it's worth asking why. Something is shifting in the architecture of human certainty, and it isn't subtle anymore. Surveys across continents tell the version of the same story. Temples emptying, churches converting into apartment complexes and climbing gyms, young people describing themselves with words like nothing in particular when asked about their faith. This isn't a single rebellion in a single country. It's a pattern, and patterns, unlike scandals or single events, demand explanation rather than outrage. Let's start somewhere honest. Human beings did not invent gods because they were stupid. That's the laziest possible explanation, and it insults the very ancestors who built irrigation systems, mapped stars without telescopes, and composed legal codes thousands of years before anyone had heard of due process. Belief in the divine wasn't a failure of intelligence, it was a remarkably elegant solution to a problem nobody could otherwise solve: the unbearable randomness of existence. Why did the crop fail? Why did the child die? Why did the river flood the village but spare the next one over? A universe without explanation is a universe that feels like it's attacking you personally. Gods gave that chaos a face, and once chaos has a face, you can negotiate with it, you can pray to it, you can blame yourself instead of the indifferent universe, which, strange as it sounds, is actually more comforting. Guilt, at least, implies control. So the real question was never, why did people believe? Of course they believed. The real question is why that particular form of explanation is losing its grip now after surviving famines, plagues, empires, and the printing press. Here's a theory, and it isn't a comfortable one for anybody. The divine, throughout most of history, operated as an answer of last resort. It filled the exact shape of whatever humanity didn't yet understand. Lightning was divine wrath until Franklin flew a kite. Disease was divine punishment until a Dutch lens grinder discovered there were entire civilizations of bacteria living on a drop of pond water. Mental illness was demonic possession until psychiatry quietly proved that a chemical imbalance produces remarkably similar screaming to an exorcism, minus the Latin. Every single time humanity solved a mystery, the territory belonging to the unexplainable shrank by exactly that much, and whatever needed a god to explain it simply didn't anymore. This is the part religious institutions rarely say out loud, because saying it out loud is fatal to the business model. The sacred has always lived in the gaps of human knowledge, not in truth, in gaps, and gaps, by their very nature, close.
Now here's where it gets genuinely interesting, because explanation alone doesn't account for the speed of what's happening now. Information used to move at the pace of a sermon. One man, one pulpit, one Sunday a week, and an audience that had no other source of cosmology, unless they happened to own a library, which statistically they did not. Compare that to a teenager in a small town today who can, within 45 seconds, watch a debate between a theologian and a physicist, read a translated philosophy text from another continent, and stumble upon a forum where 500 people who grew up in identical households describe identical doubts. The monopoly broke, not because anyone burned the temple down, but because someone built a library next to it, with no admission fee and no required belief to enter. And once you've seen the gods of a dozen different cultures, each one insisting with total sincerity that theirs is the correct one, a peculiar thought tends to arrive uninvited. If conviction alone were proof, every single one of these contradictory faiths would be true simultaneously, which is mathematically impossible. And the only way out of that puzzle is the slightly inconvenient conclusion that conviction was never the right tool for measuring truth in the first place. People raised inside a single tradition rarely confront this. people raised inside the internet confronted by Tuesday. There's also something quietly devastating that happened to the concept of moral authority. For most of history, the priest, the imam, the rabbi held a unique social position. They were simultaneously the source of comfort and the source of rules, the doctor and the judge in one robe. You went to them when your wife died, and you went to them when you wanted to know if eating shellfish would condemn you to eternal suffering, and you generally didn't ask why the same building handled both. But scandals happened, cover-ups happened. Institutions that claimed direct access to ultimate moral truth turned out to be staffed by ordinary, flawed, occasionally monstrous men who use the architecture of trust to do exactly the things that trust was supposed to prevent. Once you've watched an institution protect an abuser because the institution itself mattered more than the child in front of it, it becomes very difficult to accept that same institution's opinion about who deserves eternal damnation for the crime of falling in love with the wrong person. Trust, once broken at the foundation, doesn't rebuild evenly. It collapses in places that had nothing to do with the original crack. Consider, too, the strange psychological contract that traditional belief asks you to sign without ever showing you the fine print. You are told the universe has a plan. Comforting, until you notice the plan apparently includes childhood cancer, genocide, and earthquakes that crush sleeping infants under collapsed apartment buildings while sparing the casino next door. The believer's instinct is to say the plan is simply beyond human comprehension, which is a remarkably convenient answer because it means the plan can never be tested, only trusted. Any explanation immune to being wrong isn't really an explanation, it's a feeling wearing the costume of logic. And there is something almost touching about how hard humans have worked to patch that hole. Theologians have spent centuries constructing increasingly elegant justifications for why an all-powerful, all-loving creator allows a toddler to drown. And every single justification, no matter how beautifully worded, eventually arrives at the same destination. You simply have to have faith that it makes sense, even though, on every observable front, it does not. That's not humility, that's surrender dressed up in incense. People are tired in a very specific way now. Not tired of mystery. Mystery is wonderful. Mystery is half of what makes physics, love, and a good novel worth experiencing. People are tired of being asked to call certainty mystery and obedience virtue. There's a generational piece to this too, and it's less about rebellion than about exposure. Children raised with access to comparative religion, evolutionary biology, and basic statistics encounter something previous generations rarely did at scale: a coherent, testable, falsifiable account of how species change, how stars form, how the brain produces consciousness, none of which require a supernatural author and all of which keep predicting things correctly. A theory that keeps being right has a strange gravitational pull. It doesn't need to threaten you with eternal fire to keep your attention, it just needs to keep working.
Meanwhile, prayer has a conversion rate problem it has never solved. People pray for rain, and sometimes it rains, and they call it answered. People pray for rain, and it doesn't rain, and they call it a test of faith. Notice that both outcomes confirm the belief. That isn't evidence, that's a system designed so cleverly that it cannot lose, which is precisely the structure of every belief that was never built to be questioned in the first place. Casinos are honest about being unbeatable in the long run, at least the casino tells you the odds. There's also a quieter, more personal layer beneath all this, one that rarely makes it into academic papers about religious decline. Many people don't leave belief because of a single dramatic argument. They drift, slowly, the way a person drifts out of a relationship that technically still has all the right words, but none of the original feeling. They keep showing up to the building, they keep saying the words, and one ordinary Tuesday, mid-sentence, during a prayer they've said 10,000 times, they notice they're performing rather than feeling, and the noticing itself is the quiet, undramatic moment everything changes. No lightning bolt of revelation, just an honest internal audit that finally got filed. What replaces the void left behind is, frankly, the more fascinating question, and the honest answer is not nothing. Humans are meaning-generating animals whether or not a deity is involved. Take away the divine architecture and people don't collapse into despair, despite centuries of warnings that they would. They build meaning out of relationships, out of curiosity, out of the genuine awe of understanding how a cell divides or how light bends around a black hole. Wonder doesn't require worship. It turns out you can kneel in front of nothing and still feel the floor. There's also a kind of dignity in admitting uncertainty that traditional belief structures rarely make room for. Saying, "I don't know and I'm at peace with not knowing yet," used to sound like weakness. It increasingly sounds like the only intellectually honest sentence available to a thinking person, standing in front of an indifferent, beautiful, mathematically consistent universe. Certainty was always the seductive lie. Curiosity was always the harder, better discipline. None of this means the impulse behind religion was foolish. The impulse, the hunger for meaning, for moral structure, for community, for something larger than the grocery list of your own life, that hunger is completely real and completely human. What's changing is simply the method people are using to feed it. Fewer are choosing inherited certainty, more are choosing inherited curiosity. One asks you to stop asking questions at a specific point, the other has no stopping point at all. And that, more than any single scandal or science textbook, might be the real story of why the old answers are losing their grip on a species that finally has access to enough information to notice the seams. And maybe that's the quiet punchline underneath everything. The species that invented gods to survive the unknown has slowly become brave enough to sit inside the unknown without one. Not because the unknown stopped being frightening, because, for the first time, enough people decided the fear was worth it if the alternative was pretending to know.